to amazingly, the left didn't go away. It just changed its rationale. Its interventionism used to be rationalized by efficiency, like they're going to make the economy more efficient, but now there's going to be more equitable. It's equity argument rather than efficiency argument. Typically it's things like, promoting gender diversity or preventing discrimination or protecting the environment, all things which they believe aren't taken care of in a free market economy.
Sorry you missed the earlier part of the program when I pointed out that where you find people not represented evenly, that does not show the institutional effect, because almost nowhere in human affairs do you find people evenly represented. If you compare comparable people with respect to age, with respect to education, etc., you get a totally different picture, both with respect to blacks and women. Now, the figures that I saw, for example, show more recently that if you take black families where the husband and wife are both college educated and compare them to a white family where the husband and wife are both college educated, the black family is now earning $2,000 a year more. The problem is that very few blacks fall in that category. That when you compare category for category, then we're talking about getting people a decent education. I'm saying that you cannot say that numbers collected at the employer's place of business reflect simply the employer's policies. Those numbers reflect underlying conditions in the whole society, just as numbers collected at a hospital do not show you that the people are sick because they're in the hospital.
No, I would agree with that, but you would also have to agree that, generally speaking, women are paid less, for example, for the same jobs as men.
No, I would not. I would not agree with that. If you're talking about women with the same number of years of experience, with the same continuous service, etc., then when I look at that, I don't find that disparity. I find, for example, in many cases, the women are making more, depending on how you break the data down. The difference with women is between married women and everybody else. That's the real difference.
It's very easy to get tribal. People are inherently tribal. We all feel more for our families, as I said, than we do for people more broadly around us. The only way that you break that cycle is by having what they call social capital. And the way that social capital is created, the reason that I trust you, or that I trust my neighbor to babysit my kids, is because I know that my neighbor is a decent person. So if we encourage everyone on an individual level to abide by decency, then you can break the never-ending cycle of identity politics. But that actually requires stuff to happen outside the realm of politics. It requires an upsurge in civic morality. It requires an upsurge in things like people going to church and joining together as communities. It requires a real move toward people talking about how to deal with each other morally on a non-governmental level. If you do all that, you can recreate a social fabric that has been torn apart by identity politics.
If you look at, if you chart the government share of the GDP, the gross domestic product, the output of the economy, over like 150 years, you find that about 1900 it was about 4 or 5% of GDP. And even as late as the Second World War, it was less than 10%. But then it soared. So now the government's spending like 40% of GDP. And that spending is done by somebody. There's a whole army of what we call the new class, people who make their living off the government in various ways. Not necessarily directly employed by the government, but involved in programs that the government has forced upon the economy, such as, for example, affirmative action officers in corporations and so on. Or to a large extent colleges, the enormous growth of government-funded colleges. There's an awful lot of people who directly and indirectly make their money from the government and through politics, basically, the political power. And they need, neo-socialism really is a rationale for what they do. They believe that they're transforming society and advancing society through the exercise of government power, for which they're paid handsomely.
You see, a woman who is single at age 40, having spent 10 or 20 years raising children, is really not quite the same as a man of age 40 who's been working continuously for 20 years.
And the differential she cited is not that great, so it could easily be accounted for by the
Yes, because when I break them down the other way, I did this for the academic world, and there I found the women who are never married, which is the term the way I take it. There they were earning more than the men. And similarly, when the government did data some years ago on women who had been working continuously since high school into their 30s, there you found that they were making slightly more than men of the same description. So the difference is between married women and everybody else. And married men get an extra bonus because their wives take care of many things that enable them to put more time into their careers.
I'm sure you're aware of the fact that there are approximately 15% of all homes in which there is only one wage earner. So that when you talk about women being able to take care of things for their married mate, wage earner, The fact is that in the overwhelming majority of American homes, the women also work. And therefore, I don't think your explanation that women have other responsibilities and that's why they are...
Work can mean part-time work or full-time work. Women do not work full-time to the same extent that men. Part-time workers make less than full-time workers.
It's not that easy to force people who are very different by nature to live together. And that's really what government policy is doing right now. I mean, immigration, for example, is one aspect of this. They're bringing in people who are very, very different from Americans and telling them not to assimilate. And that imposes enormous costs on native-born Americans. And that's why, for example, Americans, generally speaking, are leaving California at such a tremendous rate at the moment. It will ultimately cause tremendous political turbulence.
Yes, all of this is I think, going to have to be confronted by those of us who began by thinking that a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society was a good idea, and are now being put in the position where its values, so to speak, are being negated, mutated, and turned against us, so that all religions have to be treated with equal respect, not just with equal consideration, but they all deserve a kind of protection, the exact opposite of what's meant by a proper multicultural society where everything can be discussed and anyone can take part in the conversation.
Unfortunately, it does seem to be par for the course now. I was disappointed, but I also felt that at least it made my point that I was trying to make at Queen's and at the University of Ottawa, that unfortunately on campus today it isn't possible to discuss a whole range of subjects because there is this very vocal minority of hardcore radical students who don't believe in free speech.
Mosques are blown up every day now in Baghdad by Muslims, something that not everyone was ready to see or to understand. Places of worship, in fact, are practically never in the innumerable civil wars and strifes that I've covered. I don't think I've ever seen a case where a place of worship has been attacked by a non-believer, by a humanist or a skeptic or an atheist. It's always places of worship are desecrated and blasphemed by other believers. I think the last time that wouldn't have been true would have been in the Spanish Civil War, when the anarchists in Catalonia did burn the Catholic churches down. I remember George Orwell saying it was a mistake that they didn't get rid of the Sagrada Familia Cathedral in Barcelona while they had the chance. Perhaps a slightly heartless observation. But now, if it's in Bosnia, if it's a synagogue or a mosque destroyed, it's by Christian, Catholic, or Orthodox fascists. If it's in Iraq, if it's a Shia mosque, it's been destroyed by the Al-Qaeda forces, and if it's a Sunni one, by the forces of the Mahdi army. But we don't call them the parties of God, we call them insurgents. We don't even call them terrorists.
If you want to talk about Islam in ways that are politically incorrect, and now if you want to talk about men's issues in a way outside of the feminist framework of the evil patriarchy, someone is going to claim that you are a proponent of hate, or that you're in some way suppressing women's rights, and that therefore you do not have any right to speak at all.
So I think that is a huge capitulation. The fact is the parties of God have Iraq in their jaws, and they're tearing the society to death, and they're desecrating religious monuments and places of worship and pilgrimages every day, and killing children in religious schools. And we worry that a small paper in Denmark publishing a satire about the Prophet Muhammad might be offensive to Muslims. Aren't Muslims upset at the mass murder of worshippers in mosques? What kind of sense of proportion have we lost, quite aside from any sense of what's obscene, what's hateful, what's murderous, and what's truly offensive? Yes, 1,000 times yes, we have to say that.
This is what's caused all the problem in the last year and a half or so, is that there have been a number of men's issues awareness societies that have tried to form. I know you're aware of this. There's been one in Toronto, there was one in Ryerson, one has just formed in Queens against a lot of opposition. There's an attempt to start one up here at the University of Ottawa. And these are men and women who want to talk about men's lives. And there's lots of things to talk about. The high rate of suicide amongst young men in the category 19 to 24, depression, problems with just feeling generally that they're blamed for all of the violence and the bad things in the world. And men and women want to talk about these issues in the way they see fit. And a lot of radical feminists see that as a profound threat.